Tonight we step into a darkness England tried desperately to erase, a night cut out of every record, as if the nation itself feared that letting it survive even a single line would shatter the monument of Elizabeth I. In the thick fog surrounding Richmond Palace, where torch flames shook as if afraid to reveal something that did not belong to the world of the living, the greatest queen in England's history was spending her final hours in a way no historian has ever dared to mention. Elizabeth, the woman who defeated the Armada, crushed assassination conspiracies and forged a golden age through sheer iron will, was no longer the invincible symbol the world remembers. That night, she refused to lie down. She stood for hours, her eyes empty as though staring straight through reality, while outside her chamber door, the entire court dissolved into chaos because no one knew what would become of the kingdom if she did not awaken long enough to speak one last word. Letters vanished without a trace, notes were burned to nothing in the hearth. The ladies in waiting who witnessed that night left the palace forever, and a trembling Privy Council argued in fear, knowing the darkness surrounding them threatened far more than the life of a queen. It threatened the very foundation of England's power. Yet, not a single line in the official chronicles was permitted to describe that night, not one sentence recording the truth. No whisper of the fear, the decay, or the moment Elizabeth finally fell silent. That night was erased, until now, and tonight you and I will step into the void history tried to seal away. We will open the door England kept locked for over 400 years and uncover what truly happened inside the room where Queen Elizabeth I lived her final hours, and why they never wanted you to know. If you're ready to enter that secret, make sure to subscribe so you never miss more buried truths like this, and leave a comment below. Why do you think England felt the need to hide an entire night from history? I read every comment, and trust me, this story is darker than you imagine. Now, it's time to begin. If we want to understand what truly happened on the final night of Elizabeth I, we have to begin with something so strange that anyone who cares about English history would immediately be startled. The most important night of the entire Tudor era, the night that ended a brilliant 44-year reign, left not a single official record behind. That is not normal. It is nothing like the reign of Henry VIII, with its meticulous notes about every meal, every outburst of temper, every hunt. Nothing like the reign of Mary I, with its endless reports on illness, rebellions, and the burnings of heretics. And least of all like the reign of Elizabeth herself, a time when every action of the Queen was considered national property, documented not by one person but by dozens. Private secretaries, advisors, ambassadors, clergy, guards, even bystanders who happened to be present. Yet when we approach her final night, history suddenly becomes empty, as if someone tore out the page the moment we tried to read it. The archival records of Elizabeth's reign are intact before and after that night. Only the window from the moment the sun set over Richmond Palace to the moment the chapel bell rang to announce the Queen's death has vanished completely. The letters sent during that night certainly once existed, because centuries later we still find notes and indirect references to them. But the letters themselves, not one remains. The diary of the lady in waiting responsible for the Queen's bedchamber, usually detailed enough to record how much rosewater wine the Queen drank on a given day and which type of leather gloves she chose for the next, stops abruptly. Not stops being written, it simply no longer exists. The report of the royal physician, who would without question have been at her bedside, is gone. Even the guardhouse log, the sort of military record that almost never disappears because it is treated as official evidence, is blank. There was no fire, no accident, no palace emergency that could explain this. There is only one possible explanation. Someone gathered everything and destroyed it intentionally. But what could force an entire court to erase the traces of a single night? What could make a nation proud of its political transparency, its legal tradition, and its royal ceremony, smother the truth beneath such heavy fog? There are scattered accounts from the next generation of servants, glimmers of light flickering in the dark, that hint at something unsettling, that certain ladies who carried written notes from that night were summoned repeatedly to give testimony and then suddenly moved to the countryside, never to return to court, that some of Cecil's letters once described the Queen's alarming condition, but after James I took the throne, those letters vanished from the archives, that someone had seen a chest of documents carried out of Richmond Palace on the very night the Queen died, never to be seen again. And this leads us to the question England has avoided for more than 400 years: why erase every piece of evidence from that night? An ordinary night needs no concealment. An ordinary death needs no revision. Only truths with the power to destroy a legend, weaken legitimacy, or threaten the very structure of authority ever require burial. The reign of Elizabeth is mythic, and a myth cannot end in chaos, weakness, or fear, especially when that myth is the foundation on which England built its next age. So the very emptiness of the record says more than any written page ever could. It tells us that her final night was anything but peaceful, that something happened behind those closed doors that made the entire court understand if the truth emerged, the legacy of Elizabeth I would crumble. And from that void, this is where the real story begins. And once we understand that the void in the record was no accident but a deliberate act, we are forced to face the question history has avoided for centuries. What happened that night that compelled all of England to erase every trace of it? The answer does not lie in documents, they were taken, but in the faint shards of memory left by those who lived through that night, people who later never dared speak louder than a whisper, and from those whispers emerges a scene no dynasty would ever accept in its official history. Elizabeth I no longer appeared as the steady, commanding queen the world revered, but as a soul suspended between life and death, standing in the darkness, as though bound by something only she could perceive. An elderly courtier would later say that the moment he opened the Queen's chamber door, he felt as though he had stepped into a chapel stripped of its cross, so silent that even the sound of his own breath felt like an insult. Elizabeth stood motionless, not leaning, not trembling, yet so unnaturally still that her stillness itself seemed threatening. Candlelight rippled across her face, revealing her eyes opened wide, not with alertness, but with a kind of awareness that stretched far beyond the world before her. They said she looked through the people in the room, her gaze cutting through the air as if following something that drifted through the darkness behind them. No one dared turn around to see whether something was truly there. The younger ladies in waiting sobbed, begging her to rest, while those who had served her a lifetime fell into quiet as if they understood that pleading no longer meant anything. "Her mind is somewhere we cannot follow," one of them later murmured. And the most frightening part was not that she refused to speak, but the unmistakable sensation that she was listening to something inside the silence. A few walls away, the Privy Council was falling into its own form of panic. A queen standing rigid for hours was not merely a sign of exhaustion, it was a nation slipping beyond the grasp of those expected to shape its future. No one dared voice the fear openly, but every man in that room knew if Elizabeth could not speak, could not sign, could not name an heir, England would face the dawn without a stable monarchy. And it was this political terror, not the impending death of a single woman, that the court needed to bury at all costs. The truth that Elizabeth, a sovereign so proud she had never allowed anyone to witness her weakness, spent her final hours in a state half lucid, half delirious, present yet no longer belonging to the place she stood. That was an image England could never accept, nor allow the world to see. In that moment, every decision had to be made. There was no time left for hope, no room for belief in a miraculous recovery, and from the instant the court recognized this, the machinery of concealment began to move, swift, heavy, and irreversible. Outside the Queen's bedchamber, the narrow corridor felt as though it were tightening, and even the footsteps of the guards changing shifts grew unnaturally careful, as if the palace itself sensed something was about to break. News traveled quickly across the cold stone walls. The Queen is not speaking. The Queen is not moving. The Queen no longer recognizes anyone but what they did not say aloud. What everyone understood yet feared to admit was the most terrifying thought of all. The Queen is not dead, but England cannot survive another hour like this. Meanwhile, in the cramped room where the Privy Council gathered, the air was so heavy it felt as though even the walls knew they were about to commit a forbidden act. The aging Cecil, his eyes hollow from months without real sleep, looked around the table and understood that there was no time left for ceremony. They needed a successor. They needed confirmation. They needed Elizabeth to sign history before her body collapsed. But how could they obtain a declaration from a woman who could no longer speak? A few council members suggested something no chronicle would ever admit. We could speak on the Queen's behalf. A deadly silence spread across the room. Not because they failed to understand the meaning, but because they knew exactly what was being proposed. The fate of England decided without Elizabeth's voice, and that kind of guilt, if it existed, could not be allowed to survive in any record. While they deliberated, inside the darkened chamber, Elizabeth remained standing like someone frozen between two worlds. Her breath thin, her gaze so distant that no one could be certain she still saw anything in front of her. A young lady in waiting serving her first night beside the Queen began to cry when she noticed the faint trembling of Elizabeth's gown, not from cold, but from exhaustion so profound that her body no longer obeyed her will. But what terrified the girl was not illness. It was the sensation that Elizabeth was conversing with someone no one else in the room could hear. At moments she tilted her head as though listening. At others her lips moved without forming words. Once an older lady whispered in fear, "She is chasing her own soul." No one answered, but no one denied it. Then, like a cold wind sweeping through the room, Elizabeth suddenly closed her eyes, not to sleep, but like a woman trying to pull herself back from the brink of something only she could sense. Everyone held their breath, a single blink, yet for Elizabeth it felt like surrendering to the fate she had resisted all her life. When a lady gently touched her elbow, hoping she might sit, Elizabeth opened her eyes and looked directly at her. That gaze, empty, yet unyielding, told everyone in the room that what kept her standing was not strength, but a desperate refusal to release the throne. But time was not on her side, nor on the side of the court. When the chapel bell tolled the hour outside, Cecil understood he had only minutes left to make a choice that could reshape all of England. He rose, opened the door slightly, and looked into the chamber where the Queen stood frozen, and for the first time in all his years serving under her, fear openly marked his face. Not fear of Elizabeth's death, but of what would happen if they failed to act before it came. For the death of a queen was a matter of ceremony, but a queen standing mute, unable to speak a final word, that was a political catastrophe the court could never allow the world to know. And so, in that moment, a decision began to form. A decision no one would ever dare write into the chronicles, yet one that became the key to erasing an entire night from the history of England. And in the very moment Cecil quietly closed that door, a ripple of invisible tension swept through the entire palace, as if Richmond itself understood that what was about to happen could never appear in any written history. He returned to the council table, his face drained of color, and looked at the others, all of them waiting for him to speak the words they feared to say. No one wanted to be the one to propose it, yet everyone knew the decision had already formed in Cecil's mind. "We cannot wait any longer," he whispered, as though afraid the stone walls might listen. "If the Queen cannot name her successor, then we must name one for her." A few men drew a sharp breath, others closed their eyes as if in prayer, but no one objected. Because even though what they were about to do violated every royal tradition, the truth was brutally clear. To keep the country from falling into chaos, they would have to put words into the mouth of a queen who could no longer speak. As the plan took shape, as the words on her behalf began slipping cautiously between sentences, something happened in the chamber next door. Something the witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. Elizabeth, who until then had remained standing rigidly, seemed to tilt slightly, like a weathered statue struggling to hold its form. Two ladies in waiting rushed toward her, but when they touched her arm, Elizabeth opened her eyes, and in that moment, brief enough for them to doubt later whether it had truly happened, she looked at them as if returning from a place no living person had ever been. Those eyes were not the eyes of someone delirious. They were the eyes of someone who had seen something that had altered her very soul. One lady swore she heard Elizabeth whisper, not in the voice of a commanding monarch, but in the voice of a woman carrying too much fear inside her heart. No, not yet. But the words were not meant for them. They were meant for something else, something they could not see, could not hear, yet sensed, lingering in the room. And at the very moment she spoke those words, the fog outside thickened so abruptly that the guards were forced to light additional torches. A night sentry later said the wind seemed to stop, and the trees along the Thames stood still, as if nature itself were listening. Inside, Elizabeth finally collapsed. She did not fall harshly. In fact, the movement was so gentle it chilled everyone, as though she had not fallen from weakness but because something holding her upright had been suddenly cut away. The ladies caught her, and in that instant, for the first time in her life, Elizabeth allowed others to touch her without resistance. They guided her toward the bed, not to lay her down but simply to help her rest against the edge of a chair. And whispers began rising in the corridor. The Privy Council had reached a decision. They would enter the room. They would ask a question Elizabeth could not answer, and they would answer it for her. But before they could open the door, Elizabeth did something none of them expected. She lifted her hand, very slowly, as though each inch cost her the remaining fragments of her strength. No one knew what she intended until her arm extended fully, pointing north. Not trembling, not hesitant, pointing as if toward the one thing the entire court had waited months to confirm. The successor. A simple gesture, yet the only action in hours that Elizabeth seemed wholly conscious of. And that gesture saved the council from the sin they were about to commit. No one dared question the miracle. No one needed to. They all interpreted her raised hand the way England needed them to. Elizabeth had chosen James VI of Scotland. In the chamber, no one breathed. In the corridor, no one spoke. Outside, the fog hung heavy like a curtain, and in that moment, the court understood that the official story for future generations had just been born. The Queen, by her final act of will, had chosen her heir. Everything that happened before and after, the fear, the delirium, the whispers to no one, the heartbreaking helplessness, would be thrown into the fire along with every document from that night. But the night was not over. Elizabeth's arm was still raised, pointing north like an unspoken declaration, but just as the ladies in waiting began to exhale in relief, the strength drained from her so quickly that her fingers curled inward and dropped onto the cushion like a dried petal. In that instant, the entire room shifted. The quiet sobs stopped. The whispered prayers faded. Only a crushing silence remained, the kind that makes you feel as though an invisible threshold has just been crossed. A young lady in waiting touched the Queen's forehead and recoiled. The chill spread faster than she expected. It wasn't the cold of someone dying. It was the cold of someone moving too quickly into a place the living could not pull her back from. The guards opened the door for the Privy Council. Cecil entered first, his face drawn tight, but his eyes betraying unmistakable, shameful relief he couldn't hide. They had what they needed, one gesture to build an entire story upon. Not everyone believed Elizabeth had been conscious when she raised her hand, but loyalty sometimes must bow to political necessity. James VI would be king. The future was locked in. Their next task was to lock away the past. They approached Elizabeth like one might approach a wilting flower, respectful, cautious, sorrowful, yet impatient. The council member recited a formal request for the Queen to confirm her successor. But Elizabeth's eyes no longer focused on anything living in the room. They drifted downward, toward an empty space before her, as if searching beneath the surface of life itself. No answer came, no sign of awareness. Cecil was the first to understand that the Queen had stepped out of her reign the moment her arm fell. He gave a tiny nod, a signal to everyone in the chamber that their work was complete, and all further decisions would be made beyond these walls. The door closed behind the council, and as the latch clicked, the ladies-in-waiting fell to their knees around Elizabeth. Not as servants of a monarch, but as women witnessing someone they cherished slip beyond reach. A faint breath left Elizabeth's lips, too weak to form words, yet strong enough for the nearest lady to feel as the last whisper of an age. An older attendant laid a hand on the Queen's chest and felt her heart beating thinly, unevenly, as though it were struggling to cling to something it could not let go. The council's footsteps faded down the corridor, but inside the chamber, the chain rose. Everyone knew Elizabeth no longer had the strength to stand, but what frightened them more was the sense that she still refused to leave this world. Some invisible cord, not of flesh but of sheer will, held her in place. One lady murmured a prayer. Another wiped the Queen's face with a warm cloth, her hands trembling at the fragility of Elizabeth's skin, now as delicate as rice paper. They tried laying her down, but though her body was soft and slack, a strange reflex stiffened her frame like a tightened bowstring. No one could explain it, the eerie sense that her body resisted the touch of the mattress. A frightened lady whispered that the Queen was not dying, she was fighting. It seemed that every last shred of Elizabeth's remaining strength was devoted to resisting the moment her head touched the pillow. This was no longer royal pride, it was the primal terror of a human being standing at the brink. After several minutes that felt like a lifetime, Elizabeth finally loosened, and her head rested on the pillow, soft, light, like the first surrender to fate. But in that same instant, something happened that made every lady-in-waiting's heart stop. The Queen's eyes opened wide, no longer cloudy, no longer lost, no longer unfocused. They were piercing, cold, unnervingly lucid, as if her consciousness had flared awake for one final instant to stare directly at whatever waited for her beyond the veil. Then her eyes closed again, softly, like a door shutting in the night. In the dense silence that followed, no one dared speak. No one dared breathe too loudly. No one knew what had just occurred. But everyone understood one thing. Elizabeth was no longer Elizabeth, and that was only the beginning of the horror England would spend the coming hours trying to bury. No one in the room dared stand after those final eyes closed, not because they believed the Queen had died, but because of the strange feeling radiating from her body, as though the very air around the bed had changed structure, becoming denser, heavier, darker than anything they had ever known. A young lady in waiting trembled as she reached out to check for breath, but just before her fingertip touched Elizabeth's cooling skin, the nearest candle flickered violently and went out, despite the absence of any breeze. The other candles immediately quivered as though something had passed between them. The women froze like small statues pinned to the floor by fear. None spoke the thought rising in all their minds, but their eyes revealed the shared question. Was the Queen still not fully gone? Outside the door, the footsteps of the guards changing shift echoed faintly, then faded, as though swallowed by the damp stone walls. The oldest lady in waiting, the one who had served Elizabeth since her youth, was the first to break the silence with a small prayer, but her voice cracked instantly, as though a cold surge up her spine had locked the words in her throat. She had never feared Elizabeth in her entire life, but tonight she feared the space surrounding her more than anything. Another lady stepped forward to straighten the pillow, but when her hand touched the edge of the bed, she jerked it back. The silk sheets, normally soft and warm, were so cold they felt dipped in ice water. No one understood why the room had become so frigid. The hearth still glowed red. The curtains remained closed. Yet the cold radiated from the bed, from Elizabeth herself, even though her body retained the faint warmth of the living. Those present began to realize the final moment they witnessed was unlike any death they had ever seen. Then a soft click sounded from the door. It wasn't the Privy Council, nor the royal physician. It was a palace guard, pale as though he had seen a ghost. He didn't dare step fully inside, lingering at the threshold as he whispered, "You should prepare yourselves. The news is spreading through the palace. They say the Queen has passed." His words sliced through the air like an invisible blade. The ladies immediately fell to their knees, some crying, some hiding their faces, some staring at Elizabeth as though unwilling to accept she was gone. But their greatest fear came in the next instant. Elizabeth suddenly inhaled, a thin, nearly silent breath, but enough to ruffle the cloth resting on her chest. A last breath? Or a refusal to let go? The elderly lady cried out, while the others staggered back as though the moment had shattered the boundary between life and death. The Queen had not stepped fully into the beyond, or she could not, or would not. Something still held her in place, and in that moment, as the silence thickened until it seemed to crush the air itself, a sound echoed somewhere in the chamber. Small, weak, drawn out, like wood creaking from cold, yet carrying the cadence of a sob. No one knew who or what had made it. They only knew that as soon as it sounded, one of the younger ladies fainted on the spot. Fear spread like an invisible black smoke, clinging to their hair, their sleeves, their breath. While the women struggled to steady one another, lanterns outside Richmond Palace began lighting up the walkways. Rumors moved faster than footsteps. From the far corridors to the kitchens, whispers drifted like moths circling a flame. The Queen is dead, or is she still alive? No one knew for certain, but all understood this. If Elizabeth still held even a single breath, however faint, England could not declare her dead, not out of reverence, but out of terror. A country cannot have a living queen, however barely alive, while preparing to crown a new king. Two monarchs cannot exist at once. Prolonged ambiguity could plunge the nation into chaos. The ladies whispered among themselves, trying to guess what was holding Elizabeth between worlds in the moment that should have been the gentlest of her life. But they could not know that just outside the chamber, a debate was erupting among the most powerful men in England. Tight as a drawn bowstring, they were ready to announce the Queen's death. They were prepared to proclaim James VI. Some had even finished drafting the speeches, and now everything rested on a single thing. A breath, so faint it seemed to belong to a woman who did not want to leave, yet no longer had the strength to stay. None of them understood that the worst part of the night, the part that led to burned documents, erased diaries, and confiscated letters, was still ahead. In just a moment, every safe boundary the court had built would be shattered by something so horrifying that no one dared recount it in full. A brief stillness fell over the room, heavy as a velvet curtain dropping over a stage before a tragedy begins. The ladies in waiting clutched each other's hands, eyes red as they stared at Elizabeth's body flickering between two worlds. They couldn't be sure whether the Queen was alive or not, but all of them sensed a quiet dread swelling through the chamber like the shadow of the night outside. Then hurried footsteps echoed from the corridor, not the dignified stride of the Privy Council, nor the steady rhythm of the guards. These were running footsteps, urgent, uneven, nearly panicked. The door burst open, and the royal physician Thomas Brown appeared, breathless, his face pale as wax. He didn't wait to be summoned. With one glance he rushed straight to the Queen's bedside. But when he placed his hand on Elizabeth's wrist, her body recoiled gently, as if performing one last reflex, and everyone in the room jerked back. The physician lurched away in a shock they had never seen in him before, his aged eyes widening. A lady asked through trembling lips, "What did you feel?" And the physician, who had witnessed hundreds of deaths at court, who had touched the plague-stricken, who had heard the final moans of those he could not save, now had to swallow hard several times before managing to say, "She has not gone, but she is no longer here." The vagueness of those words ignited a fear no prayer could quiet. An older lady seized Elizabeth's hand, searching for a pulse, and for a split second her eyes widened in terror. There was a heartbeat, but not a human one. It did not pulse with the rhythm of life. It tapped faintly, inconsistently, like a distant knocking coming from a locked room deep within a castle. Outside, voices grew louder as several members of the council gathered by the door, murmuring urgently. They wanted to go in again. They wanted confirmation. They needed to be absolutely certain Elizabeth was ready for them to crown James. Time was working against them, and Elizabeth's fragile life was too. But as they prepared to open the door, a sharp crash erupted inside the room. All the ladies flinched. A wooden stand beside the bed, something with no reason to topple, had suddenly tipped and slammed onto the floor as if pushed. The physician staggered backward, clutching his chest, his dry lips parting in horror. One young lady let out a small wail and collapsed into the arms of the others. Elizabeth lay still, but the air around her rose in a cold wave that snuffed out the weakest candles with harsh little pops. The council outside held their breath. They heard the chaos, whispers, sobs, hurried footsteps, but not what had caused them. Only a long, dreadful silence followed, as though the entire room was waiting for something else. Cecil stepped inside first. He opened his mouth to speak, but the moment he crossed the threshold, his gaze locked onto something that froze his blood. Elizabeth, who moments earlier had trembled like a dying leaf, now appeared strangely blurred in the wavering firelight. Her body hadn't changed, but the air around her rippled, coiling and vibrating like water stirred by an unseen hand. The physician whispered, "This is not natural." Suddenly Elizabeth's lips parted. A lady leaned in, but immediately recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth, not because of what was said, but because the voice that came out wasn't Elizabeth's. It was rough, thin, and resonant, as though echoing from deep within her chest, like a voice trapped for centuries. Everyone in the room froze. Elizabeth whispered again, clearer this time, but no less chilling. "Do not let them in." But the door was already open, and the council had already entered. Cecil clenched his hands so tightly he nearly dropped his leather glove. He understood this was worse than any outcome he'd anticipated. The Queen, in her final moments, had spoken, and her warning, those words, were something they could never allow to be known. No one in the room could have guessed that after that single sentence, what came next would terrify the court so deeply that they would burn every piece of evidence from the entire night. But it was coming, very soon, like a storm whose eye had already formed in that small chamber. No one dared move as the words dissolved into the air. Like the crack of a mirror everyone could see, but no one dared acknowledge. Elizabeth lay there, her lips still parted as though trying to speak again, but the final words seemed trapped somewhere between life and death. Cecil swallowed his confusion and stepped forward, clinging to the role of a loyal counselor, guiding, shielding, deciding on behalf of a dying dynasty. But the moment he stood beside the bed, Elizabeth opened her eyes again. Not fully, just a slit. But that small slit made the entire room recoil without meaning to. Her gaze was not directed at any of them. It passed through them, farther, deeper, as though she were tracking something moving in the invisible space just behind their shoulders. That look chilled Cecil to the bone. He had seen delirium, he had heard deathbed ramblings, but this was neither the gaze of someone surrendering nor the gaze of someone afraid. It belonged to someone seeing something no living person could bear to look at. A young lady burst into sobs, not because Elizabeth was dying, but because she seemed to be seeing something they could not. Dr. Brown murmured with trembling lips, "We must not prolong this. We cannot wait any longer." The council gathered at the foot of the bed, each man avoiding the other's eyes, knowing the moment to end the Tudor reign had come. They needed to show that Elizabeth was too weak to make decisions, and thus all power must immediately pass to James VI. But when Cecil opened his mouth, ready to repeat James's name in a firm tone to cement the narrative they were about to impose on history, Elizabeth moved. Not violently, not in refusal, just a slow, slight tilt of her head, deliberate enough to freeze the entire room, and then, in a voice so faint one had to hold their breath to hear it, Elizabeth whispered two more words. "Not him." A silent bolt of lightning shot through every person standing there. No one dared confirm they heard it. No one dared react, but each of them had heard the same thing. Elizabeth had not only told them not to let them in, she had rejected the successor. Word. That could never appear in any record. It could never leave this room. It could never be known by any soul in England, from peasant to peer, that Elizabeth, the symbol of the nation's unity, had opposed the very heir the council needed to install for political survival. Cecil's shoulders sagged, not from fear or despair, but with the posture of a man realizing his entire career now stood on the edge of a cliff. If that sentence were recorded, if it escaped this chamber, England would never accept James I. Civil war could erupt. The Tudor bloodline itself would fall under suspicion, and the new monarchy would begin with a fracture that would never close. He had to erase the words instantly. The ladies gasped, one covering her mouth to keep from sobbing aloud. Dr. Brown clenched his hands, trying to steady himself, but unable to hide the shudder running through him. Elizabeth fell silent again. Her eyes closed once more, but not like before. This was the closing of someone who had seen the final thing she needed to see. The living did not understand it, but they felt the shift. It wasn't death approaching. Elizabeth had already stepped 1 foot beyond the threshold, leaving behind those trembling mortals who were trying to finish a story she had not permitted them to write. And as if fate wished to underline the gravity of that moment, a sound echoed down the corridor. Not the chapel bell marking the hour. This sound was heavier, deeper, a resonant toll announcing a loss too vast for Richmond Palace to contain. One of the ladies screamed, hands over her mouth, realizing what none of them wanted to admit. The chapel bell only rang like that when a royal death had been confirmed, but they had issued no announcement. No one had ordered it. No message had been sent. Yet the bell tolled, because the world outside had already decided what the world inside still hesitated to accept. Cecil leapt to his feet, a harsh tension overtaking his expression. No one knew when the rumor began. No one knew who spoke first. But now the midnight fog would carry the news across Richmond, then London, faster than anything the council could contain. And that would push the court toward the brink of panic. The truth was not yet certain, but the outside world now believed Elizabeth I was dead. And in this small chamber, among those trembling at her bedside, the Queen stirred again. She breathed, though it sounded like a breeze turning the final page of a centuries-old book. The bell tolled once more, and in that moment the court understood this night would not end gently. Everything they had tried to hide was about to slip out of their grasp. The bell kept tolling, each strike like a cold blade slicing through the silence that desperately tried to keep the room from collapsing into chaos. The ladies clung to one another, sobbing as if the sound itself were a sign that something greater than human authority had arrived to claim what belonged to it. Cecil rushed to the window, yanked the curtains aside, and stared down into the fog-filled courtyard. Servants had dropped their baskets and abandoned their tasks, clustering into tight little groups, whispering frantically. Lantern light flickered across pale faces. They did not know the truth, but they believed the bell, as if the night itself had issued a verdict. Everything outside was spreading like fire across a thatched roof, and though only moments earlier the council could have chosen when to announce the Queen's death, now that choice had been stripped from them. Once the people believed Elizabeth was gone, the court could not reverse the story. The wave was already carrying them, strong, merciless, unstoppable. The chamber door burst open again. A guard captain entered, his cloak drenched in mist, his breath broken and uneven. He bowed deeply before speaking. "My lord, the news has reached the West Gate. They're saying the Queen has passed." Cecil closed his eyes for a moment, not in prayer, but because it was the only courtly gesture that could mask the fury and despair rising within him. He had spent his entire life managing truth. Now truth was spilling out on its own, seeking no permission, ignoring the authority of history. He asked evenly, "Did you tell them otherwise?" "No one will listen, my lord," the guard replied, voice trembling. "They say the bell never lies." The royal physician trembled like a leaf. "But she still has breath," he stammered. We cannot yet." His protest died on his tongue as a lady near the bed turned sharply, her eyes wide with terror. "Look," she whispered, "her breathing. It's changed." Every gaze fixed on Elizabeth, and this time they did not need to wait long to understand. Her chest rose once, slightly, softly, and then stilled. Completely. Her body settled into absolute silence, not the fragile quiet of a dying moment, but the final, frozen stillness of a lake sealed under winter ice. One lady collapsed to the floor. Another screamed before her mouth was covered. Cecil stood motionless, hand gripping the bed frame, eyes unblinking. Death had truly come. This time it was not hesitation or reflex. Elizabeth, the mother of England, the beloved of the Golden Age, had left the world. But instead of relief or clarity, the silence after Elizabeth's final breath felt like a vast abyss opening beneath them, bottomless and unknowable. No one had yet spoken when something else rooted them to the spot. The candle at Elizabeth's bedside suddenly flared, burning twice as bright, then stretched upward into a long, thin flame, like a glowing hand reaching skyward, before extinguishing with a hiss. The other candles dimmed in a single shudder, like the house itself flinched. The room fell into a faint, trembling glow, casting Elizabeth's face in a pale, waxen pallor. Dr. Brown stumbled back, crossing himself, his skin drained of color. A lady choked through her tears. She didn't want to leave. Cecil snapped a warning glare, yet even he could not shake the thought sliding through his mind. It was not that her soul refused to go, but that something had pulled it away too quickly. Yet regardless of the cause, reality demanded action. The court needed authority, not hysterical women. He turned, voice firm. "No one will speak a word of the final breath. Everything that happened here will be aligned with royal ceremony. We will declare that the Queen passed peacefully, lucid, and confidently naming her successor." But he had not finished the sentence when a faint sound rose from the foot of the bed, so soft most did not hear it, but loud enough to drain the color from the physician's face yet again. It sounded like fabric sliding over wood, or fingernails brushing lightly against the bed frame. No one breathed. No one spoke. And in that suspended sliver between life and truth, everyone understood the same thing. The night was not over. Everything they believed had just closed, had only begun to open. That faint sound, like fingernails lightly scratching across wood, came again, clearer and longer, freezing everyone in the room like statues. None of them wanted to look toward the source, yet their eyes were pulled there as if an invisible string jerked their attention forward. Dr. Brown, who should have been the calmest among them, stepped back, gripping his notebook so tightly his knuckles turned white. An elderly lady collapsed to her knees, whispering frantic prayers. But what filled the room with terror was not the sound itself. It was where it came from beneath the bed. Directly under the place where Elizabeth's body had just fallen still. Cecil slowly leaned forward, but he dared not get close. He only tried to summon the most rational explanation he could to steady the panic rising in the room. Perhaps an animal passed by, he forced out, though even he heard the tremble in his voice. A mouse or the wind. But no one believed it. The air was too dense, too heavy, too still, as if a burial shroud had already been pulled over the room. There was no wind. The windows were shut, and the sound did not resemble a mouse. It sounded like something being held back, something trying to follow Elizabeth's soul, but unable to break free. The candle near the foot of the bed suddenly flared, then tightened into a single thin flame, like an eye opening in the dark. A cold draft swept across the floor. Though the door was still closed tight, the youngest lady burst into sobs, covering her face. "Please, don't let her suffer any more." But this was not physical pain. The tension gripping the room belonged to something unfinished. Then, suddenly, like an invisible string being sharply pulled, the sheet covering Elizabeth lifted a fraction of an inch. The nearest ladies fell backward in fright. They had not imagined it. The sheet moved, not from wind, not from the shifting of the mattress. It lifted, trembled, then settled again. One lady nearly fainted, and the physician seized her arm to keep her from screaming. Cecil stood frozen, unblinking, as if nailed to the floor. The only thought running through him was, if this ever leaves this room, not only the crown but the entire country will collapse under the weight of superstition. He did not believe in spirits, but he could not deny that the death of a queen carried its own gravity in this world. Elizabeth had once told all of Europe, "I have the heart and stomach of a king." Someone like that might not leave quietly. The sheet stopped moving, but the tension did not ease. An absolute silence wrapped the room, heavy as a stone sealing a tomb. In the air there was the sense that someone, not human, was standing among them, listening to every breath, tracking every heartbeat. And then, from outside the door, a soft knock sounded. Not the guard's knock, not a messenger's knock. This knock was gentle, slow, measured, like someone with endless time. Cecil spun around, raising his hand to demand silence. No one moved. A nearby officer swallowed hard and asked, "Who is out there?" They saw it instead. No answer came, only a second knock. Slow, precise, as if the one knocking awaited an invitation. The youngest lady whispered through tears. "Don't open it," Elizabeth said. "Don't let them in." But the officer had already placed his hand on the latch, not out of bravery, out of duty. The door opened just a sliver, and in that instant, every candle in the room was extinguished, as if crushed by an unseen hand. The room fell into a darkness so complete that no one could distinguish bed from wall, person from shadow. Only the ragged breathing of the living remained. And in that moment, something not human exhaled a long, thin breath right in the center of the room. A chill so sharp swept across the windows that drops of condensation froze into tiny crystals. Then, from the darkness where Elizabeth lay, where her body had still been warm not long before, a faint, blurred, pale Yule light emerged. No one had time to think, no one had time to run. They could only stand there, trembling, staring at the growing glow as something from the other side seemed to open its eyes. And in that instant, everyone in the chamber finally understood the truth the court had burned out of history. Elizabeth I did not leave in silence. She did not leave alone. And on that night, the doorway between worlds had remained open longer than anyone dared admit. None of them understood what was about to step forward from that glow, But they knew one thing clearly. The truth of that night must never escape this room. And yet, someone else was already on their way. Someone who would witness everything. Someone they could not stop. That pale blue light pulsed like the breath of a being trying to re-enter the body it had once inhabited, drowning the room in a cold, misty glow that resembled neither candlelight nor moonlight, but rather the light that might rise from the bottom of a lifeless lake. Everyone in the room pressed themselves against the walls, none daring to go near the bed, not even Cecil, the man long regarded as the iron heart of the court. In one corner, a young lady collapsed to her knees, hands covering her face, shaking her head over and over as if trying to banish the sight unfolding before her eyes. But the light did not fade. It stretched into a thin ribbon, like vapor being pulled upward from nothingness, then gathered into a trembling shape just above Elizabeth's body. The form was not human, yet not entirely formless either. Its edges flickered, wavering as though torn between dissolving or becoming something solid. In an instant, the fringe of the glowing mass drifted across Elizabeth's face, and terror rippled through the room when her closed eyes parted slightly. Not wide, not moving, just open enough for everyone to understand that what they were witnessing was not a natural phenomenon. A lady screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness where every candle had already died. From far down the corridor came the sound of frantic running, footsteps, shouted orders, armor striking armor. Someone was rushing toward them, fast, desperate, unrestrained. Cecil turned his head, fear stiffening his features even as a flicker of hope lit his eyes. He knew who would dare run toward the Queen's chamber at an hour forbidden to all. Robert Cecil, heir to his father's political legacy, was not that person. The one approaching was someone else entirely, the last man Elizabeth ever allowed to enter her private rooms without permission, the one presence that could unravel the secret they were all trying to bury. The footsteps stopped at the door, a sharp, uneven breath, then a voice, familiar, cutting, trembling ever so slightly. "Open this door, now." The eldest lady grabbed Cecil's arm, whispering, "You must not let him in. If he sees, everything will fall apart." Cecil knew that far too well, but it was already too late. The door handle turned once, then a heavy blow shook the wooden frame. The light hovering over the bed shuddered violently, as if aware that someone on the other side was about to crash into the room. It tightened, thickened, and sank lower, hovering inches above Elizabeth's face. The voice outside rose again, this time louder, burning with the authority of a man who had stood beside Elizabeth not only in matters of state, but in the long years she fought to preserve her crown. "I said, open this door. Not a counselor, not a physician, not a servant." The man outside was Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, the one who had once been the son in Elizabeth's winter years, the man who softened her hardest battles, the only soul whose grief could fracture her legacy more than death itself. Cecil knew that if Essex saw what was happening inside this room, not just the bells, but all of England would tremble. And he also understood something even worse. Essex did not know Elizabeth was in her final hour. He had been summoned too late, and now he arrived at the precise moment when the doorway between worlds had opened. Cecil lunged toward the door in one last desperate instinct, gripping the latch just as Essex slammed his shoulder against it for the third time. The door burst open. The pale blue glow spilled into the corridor like living smoke. Essex froze on the threshold. In his eyes, first shock, then terror, then a grief so sharp it was like watching a heart shatter in real time. He looked at Elizabeth, at the hovering light, at the trembling women, and then he gasped, "God in heaven, what have you done to her?" No one answered, because at that exact moment the light convulsed, shrank to the size of a candle flame, then shot downward in a streak of lightning, plunging straight into Elizabeth's chest. Her body jolted, visibly, violently, undeniably. Life could not return from such a jolt, but another truth did. Elizabeth did not leave this world in the peace the court would proclaim. She left in a final battle, one no historian would ever be allowed to record. Essex stepped fully into the room, breath tearing through his chest like a man stabbed through the heart with hot iron, and now that the secret had been revealed to the one person they could not silence, the court was forced to face the nightmare they feared most, controlling a story no longer controllable. The night was far from over, and what would happen next would make them understand why the chronicles had to be rewritten so thoroughly that no trace of the truth could survive. Essex froze at the threshold, his face struck as though the pale, otherworldly light had slapped his very soul. Everyone in the room instinctively stepped aside, no one daring to speak, no one daring to stop him. The shrinking glow trembling on Elizabeth's chest quivered again, like a frail creature clinging to the last thing it refused to release. Essex looked stunned to the point where he seemed unable to breathe. He took a slow step forward, eyes locked on the figure of the woman who had once been his pride, his fury, and the most wounding love of his life. No one knew whether in that moment he saw Elizabeth the Queen, or the woman who had held his heart through triumph and downfall. No one knew whether he saw that strange glow as her soul or as the curse of the crown still clinging to her. All they knew was that when he placed his hand on the edge of the bed, the entire room changed its breath. The lone candle still burning, twisted violently as if strangled, casting warped gold shadows across the terrified faces of the ladies. Cecil stood near the door, too late to stop Essex now. He understood with crushing clarity. The moment Essex stepped into this room, nothing could ever be buried again. Essex leaned closer, his face only inches from Elizabeth's, and as if struck by an invisible blow, he staggered back, because just then, Elizabeth's eyes parted once more. Not wide, not focused, not looking at anyone, but opening as the final reflex of a soul torn from its body too quickly. Essex's breath fell apart. He sank onto the edge of the bed, hands trembling uncontrollably. He was no longer the proud, reckless Earl who once challenged the entire council. He was simply a man who had just lost the last anchor of his life. "Elizabeth." His voice cracked, like fabric tearing. "Why didn't you send for me sooner?" The eldest lady lowered her head, avoiding his gaze. Because the truth she carried, that Elizabeth had forbidden Essex's name in her final days, was a truth he must never be allowed to hear. The unnatural glow slowly thinned, fading like smoke after a fire, but not disappearing completely. It left behind a cold residue so intense that the moisture on the window pane splintered into tiny frost cracks. Elizabeth no longer moved. No breath, no sign of life, except for a strange tension carved on her thin, translucent face, as though death had not released her, but had merely paused her mid-journey. Essex took her hand. It was cold as marble, yet still shaped by a lifetime of refusing to yield. He lowered his head until his forehead touched the back of her hand and whispered only 2 words, shattered and bare. "I'm here." The air thickened into a solid weight. Cecil watched, realizing that every political maneuver, every carefully crafted narrative, every council decision, they all shrank into insignificance beside a love the crown could never control. But what he feared far more was Essex demanding the truth about Elizabeth's final hours, because that truth could never be spoken, never permitted, not to the public, not to historians, not even to the man crying before her now. But Essex did not ask anything. He only gripped her hand tighter, and his voice broke into a vow forged from anguish. "If you let her die alone, every person in this room will answer for it." A young lady sobbed, but Essex did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on Elizabeth, memorizing every last line of the woman he loved. with a love no one ever permitted him to have. Then, everyone heard it. A tiny sound, faint as a pin striking stone, but perfectly timed as Essex leaned closer to Elizabeth's chest. A click. Essex stopped breathing. Dr. Brown rushed forward. The ladies recoiled, huddling together, and Elizabeth moved her lips. Not revival, not returning life, but the last effort of something far away, far deep, far beyond the reach of the living. A whisper escaped, so soft it might have been mistaken for a draft if wind could speak. Robert. Just one word, just his name, but it cut through the room like a bell tolling from the heart of the earth. Essex collapsed forward, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably. Elizabeth's final words, spoken for him, not the new king, not the council, not England, told Cecil why this night had to be erased from history entirely, without rewriting, without trace, without any generation ever learning that Elizabeth did not die in the calm majesty of a sovereign, but in the call of a lovesick heart, and under the shadow of something supernatural no one could explain. Essex lifted his head, eyes bloodshot, staring directly at Cecil, which, he muttered feebly, half horrified, might have distorted his perception of his own sight. He did not see. "I want to know," he growled, "what happened in this room?" And Cecil understood. The silence around this night began here. But to keep it, the court would have to do something it had never dared before, and the night was still far from over. No one answered Essex, not because they refused, but because none of them could breathe. The room, which only minutes ago had held the fragile last breaths of the dying, now felt like a fracture between two worlds, and all any human could do was stand there, trembling, trying to keep their own soul from being dragged into the thickening darkness gathering by the second. Essex still knelt at the bedside, his grip crushing Elizabeth's hand to white marble, his eyes sharp as two blades cutting through the haze. "I asked," he repeated, his voice low and heavy as an anvil dropped onto stone. "What happened here?" Cecil understood the danger instantly. If Essex learned the truth, he would not stay silent. He would rage, and a man beloved by soldiers, backed by a powerful family, adored by the public, a man like that, enraged, could ignite a rebellion with a single breath. "My Lord Essex," Cecil said, stepping forward, his voice strained but steady. "Her Majesty passed in peace. My deepest condolences." "Peace?" Essex barked, a laugh so sharp it sliced through the air. "Peace." He jabbed a finger toward the sheets, still wrinkled from Elizabeth's convulsions. "Do you take me for a fool?" Dr. Brown tried to intervene. "My lord, what you witnessed, not everything is as it—" "Shut your mouth," Essex snarled. "You're shaking like that over a simple death, or because you saw something I haven't." No one dared respond. And then the worst moment of the night arrived. Elizabeth's body, completely still moments ago, tilted ever so slightly, as if someone had laid a cold hand on her shoulder and pulled. Not the movement of a living person, not a twitch of dying muscles. It was a touch, frozen, and not human. The lady screamed. One collapsed. Essex staggered to his feet, eyes wide, while Cecil went pale in a way that made everyone think he might faint. Dr. Brown clutched his chest, muttering feverishly about cold air and a soul not yet gone. No one moved as the cold spread outward in a circle, from the bed to the air to the very stones beneath their feet. It felt as though they were standing on a frozen lake. And then a faint sound rose from the floor, neither wind nor wood, but like silk scraping stone, or a long garment brushing across the dark. Cecil blinked only once. When he opened his eyes, he saw it clearly, a patch of darkness thicker than ordinary shadow gathering beneath the bed, like ink blooming in water. "Out," Cecil gasped. "Everyone, out of this room, now." But Essex didn't move. He stepped forward, half a pace, his eyes bloodshot, his voice a blade flexing. I'm not leaving. I will stay with the Queen." The eldest lady wept. "My Lord Essex, please. You cannot stay now. There are things that do not belong to us." Essex turned, and the look he gave her was the look of a man staring straight into an abyss without blinking. "I loved her," he said, "and if something tonight tries to take her soul, I will not let it steal her from me again." That feeling, the entire room felt it, was not gentle devotion. It was the love of a man who would burn the world to keep what he cherished. Cecil knew this, and he knew he had to stop it immediately. "Essex," he whispered, no longer as a statesman but as a man who saw catastrophe forming at his feet. "You do not understand. Whatever is in this room is not something you can fight." But Essex stepped again, then again, and just as he reached toward Elizabeth, the shadow beneath the bed moved, not trembling, not fluttering, moving like a creature crawling out of its den. Essex hadn't touched Elizabeth yet when a breath of frigid air blasted across his hand, like the exhale of a beast born from the darkest nightmare. He recoiled by instinct, and at that exact moment Elizabeth's eyes, closed only seconds earlier, flew open wide. And that was when the truth of her final night finally revealed itself. Not through words, not through breath, not through the movement of a body, but through an expression no portrait of her had ever seen. Terror. Not terror of dying, terror of seeing what stood directly behind Essex, and she looked straight at it. "Essex." And he looked straight at it. Essex turned toward the direction of her gaze. Slow, very slow, like a man aware that what he was about to see could shatter his sanity. Cecil wanted to shout, "Don't look!" But he was too late. Essex turned into the darkness behind him, and his face drained to ash. He saw what Elizabeth saw, and in that instant, he understood why the entire court had chosen silence for 4 centuries. Because the truth of the night Elizabeth's side died had no place in human history, and the thing standing before Essex, the thing no mortal language could describe, began to move toward him. Essex pulled his head. Essex did not move, his breath freezing in his throat like a shard of ice. When he turned fully around, his pupils stretched so wide they looked ready to split. Nothing in the world of men had prepared him for this moment. Not battlefields, not court intrigue, not the wrath of monarchs. The thing standing in the darkness had no fixed shape. It was not a person. It was not a shadow. It was a tear in the fabric of existence itself, as if the night were folding inward to become a breathing entity, exhaling only faint, hair-thin hisses that seemed audible only to the soul. Essex stepped back without realizing he had moved. Cecil saw the terror in his eyes and knew things had gone far beyond anything they could control, yet even he could not tear his gaze away from the presence at the far end of the room. The patch of darkness expanding and contracting like a door pulled by an unseen wind. Then it advanced, not walking, not crawling, but shifting forward as though the 4 were dragging it closer to them. The ladies screamed, but their screams shattered noiselessly, swallowed before they reached the air. Dr. Brown slid down the wall, collapsing to his knees, hands pressed over his ears as he muttered, "No, no, no, don't let it see me." Essex remained rooted, trembling but refusing to flee. In his eyes lived a terror bordering on despair, yet beneath it burned something else. He was ready to die here for Elizabeth. The dark shape drifted toward the bed. When it was no more than an arm's length from the edge, it stopped. Then slowly, very slowly, as if savoring the perfect moment to act, it tilted its head. Not toward Essex, toward Elizabeth. The Queen, though dead, still had her eyes open, the pupils still locked on the darkness as if tethered to it. The fear carved into her face was not the fear of dying. It was the terror of someone who had witnessed something far beyond death. Cecil gathered the last scraps of courage he had and whispered only one sentence: "Don't let it touch her." But he had no idea what human beings could possibly do to stop something that did not belong to their world. The darkness stirred again. A thin limb, childlike in proportion, trembling as if testing the air, extended from its center and reached toward Elizabeth's chest. Essex shouted, "No!" and lunged forward, but Cecil seized him and yanked him back, and when the shadow touched Elizabeth's skin, a burst of white light exploded from her body. Not the pale bluish glow from before, not cold, not ghostly, but bright like the sun compressed into a single blazing point. The ladies shielded their eyes. Dr. Brown fell backward. Cecil bowed his head by pure instinct, and Essex, he stood there, unguarded, unflinching, staring straight into the light as though he had waited his entire life for it. The darkness recoiled violently, snapping backward as if yanked into another world. The light expanded in a brief, searing pulse, then extinguished, completely. When it vanished, Elizabeth lay still, her eyes gently closed as though she had finally found her final sleep. No fear, no tension, no sense of being trapped between worlds. But the room did not breathe again. Essex stood motionless, his hand still extended toward the Queen, no longer trembling. His face was wet with tears, but his eyes were the eyes of a man who had witnessed something he would never escape. Cecil stepped forward and laid a hand on his shoulder. "My Lord Essex," he said softly, "everything you saw tonight must never leave this room." Essex turned to him. His eyes held no rage now, only the steady, terrifying calm of a warrior who had just walked through hell, silent, knowing, and dangerous. "No one," he said, "would ever believe it." Then softer, like the faintest dying breath, "But I do." Cecil's grip on his shoulder tightened, not in comfort, but in warning. Tonight can never be told. Outside the window, the final toll of the bell rang. Long, low, like the sigh of an entire kingdom ending. And inside the room, no one dared look beneath the bed again, because the dark shape was gone. Not gone like it had vanished, but gone like it was waiting. That night was not just the death of a queen. It was the moment the entire kingdom understood that Elizabeth I did not die from illness or age. She died from something she had fought all her life, something only she could see. And the court understood one thing with absolute clarity: some truths are not meant for history, and some nights must be buried forever. The room still held the echo of that final burst of light, an invisible weight that pressed so heavily on everyone's chest they could barely breathe. Essex sat at the edge of the bed, his hand resting on Elizabeth's cooling fingers, and for an instant, all the chaos, the running footsteps, the screams, the sobbing, fell silent, as if even time bowed its head to this moment. No one dared speak. No one dared step closer. The death of Elizabeth, however much they understood what had just happened, still had to be treated as the death of a queen. But what they knew, and what England must never know, was that the Queen had not died alone, and she had not died in peace. Cecil knew he had to act immediately. "Close the door," he whispered, his voice ragged. "No one, not a single soul, leaves this room until I decide what must be done." The guards slammed the doors shut. The room fell into a silence so sharp it scraped down the spine. The air was thick enough that each breath seemed to rebound painfully inside their lungs. But that silence did not last. From the courtyard below, whispers began rising like smoke. Townsfolk, attendants, guards. Word had already spread that the Queen was dead. Lanterns were being lit, crowds forming, waiting for an official announcement. Rumors, as always, moved faster than truth. A young officer inside the room murmured, "My Lord Cecil. In moments, they'll demand answers. We must make the proclamation, arrange the rites." But Cecil raised a hand sharply. His face had gone pale, but his eyes were sharper than blades. From this moment on, he was no longer merely the Queen's right hand. He was the man holding the fate of an entire nation, and he knew what his duty was. Erase this night. Essex stayed where he was, completely unmoved by the growing urgency behind him. He looked only at Elizabeth, never once glancing away. On his face was an emotion that frightened Cecil more than fury ever could, the quiet of a grief nothing could contain. Essex had always been quick to anger, quick to ignite, but now he was silent, and that silence turned Cecil's hands cold. Finally, Cecil stepped beside him. "My Lord Essex," he said. His voice softened even though his resolve was iron beneath it. "What happened in this room cannot have witnesses." Essex lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot but disturbingly clear. "I am a witness," he said, "and I will not let you twist her death." "We are not twisting it," Cecil answered. "We are saving the kingdom." Essex gave a short, broken laugh, warped with pain. "Saving the kingdom, or saving the throne you've already chosen for her successor?" Cecil's jaw tightened. "There is no other choice. James will be king. The realm needs one story, one stable, unified story. The people need reassurance. They do not need to know how the Queen," he glanced down at her body, "truly passed." A tear slid down Essex's cheek. Not a weak tear, but the tear of a man realizing too late that he had been left behind in the life of the woman he loved. "I will not allow the truth to be buried," he said, his voice rising like falling steel. Cecil met his gaze. "My Lord Essex, if you speak a word of what happened tonight, just one word, half a word, you will shatter England. You will start the new reign in blood. They will call you mad or a traitor." Essex clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. He looked around the room, the trembling ladies, Dr. Brown barely conscious, the guards gripping their swords to steady their shaking hands, and Cecil standing between terror and duty. At last, Essex said, "I will remain silent." Cecil exhaled, relieved, but only slightly. "But," Essex continued, "not for your sake, for hers." A heavy silence fell again. Cecil then began issuing orders, his voice sharp and final like a sentence being delivered. "Light all the candles, change the sheets, draw the curtains. No one must see this room as it was. Dr. Brown, you will write that the Queen passed in her sleep. No, she passed peacefully after naming her successor." Dr. Brown bit his lip until it bled, but nodded. A trembling lady whispered, "My lord, her eyes, they won't close." Cecil turned to look at Elizabeth, and indeed, the Queen's eyes remained open, though the terror had vanished. What lingered was the vacant distance of someone who had looked into something no human should ever see. Essex stepped forward, knelt, and placed his shaking hand gently over her eyelids. He closed them, softly, reverently, as if each blink she had ever taken was a secret he was now responsible for guarding. When Elizabeth's eyes finally shut, he bowed his head and pressed his lips to her fingers. Cecil turned away, not out of tenderness, but because he knew this moment must never appear in any record. As the ladies began to prepare the Queen's body, Essex rose, his eyes darkening like a gathering storm. He stared at Cecil and spoke a sentence no one in the room would ever forget. "You may bury this night, but this night will never forgive you." Cecil did not answer. He knew Essex was right. And worse, he knew the night was not finished, not for the court, not for the crown, and not for the entity that had appeared in this room. Because when they lifted Elizabeth from the bed, the space beneath it was empty, yet the stone floor still held a dark stain, cold as iron, and everyone understood one thing with bone-deep certainty. That thing had not left the palace, and the night was far from done with its claim. When Elizabeth's body was lifted from the bed, every movement was as delicate as touching glass, not because they feared hurting the dead, but because they feared waking whatever still lingered in that room. The ladies in waiting knelt around her, fingers woven tightly together to hide their trembling. Dr. Brown stood as far back as he could while still performing his duty, his eyes avoiding every shadow in the room. He knew that if he looked even once more, he would lose 10 years of his life. Cecil did not look away. He stared directly at the cold, dark stain beneath the bed, memorizing its shape as if he could calculate how many layers of lies he would need to bury before the truth was lost forever. "Take her to the ceremonial chamber," he ordered. "No one leaves alone. No one looks back." No one argued. They carried Elizabeth out, and only then did they realize the room had grown terrifyingly weightless, as if the burden of death did not lie in the Queen's body, but in what remained under the stone floor. As they stepped into the corridor, fog from outside drifted in like a long sigh. A guard opened his mouth to speak, but when he saw Essex walking last, his face turned ashen. Those eyes looked like the eyes of a man who had descended into the underworld and somehow returned. The guard stepped aside instantly, as if brushing against his own fate. They brought Elizabeth to the ceremonial chamber. Candles were lit, flowers scattered across the hall, soft prayers drifting into the air. All of it created the illusion that her death had been peaceful, royal, sacred. But only those who had been in that room knew nothing about the death of Elizabeth I was peaceful. Cecil stood beside the ceremonial bed, adjusting the lace on the final gown the Queen would ever wear. No one knew whether he was steadying his hands or forcing his nerves to obey him. He turned to Dr. Brown. "Your death certificate must be written before dawn. Record that she passed in her sleep." Brown choked. "My lord, what you ask is a lie." "No," Cecil said, his gaze so cold the entire room fell silent. "It is peace." In the corner, the ladies preparing Elizabeth's body suddenly froze. One of them touched her neck, and her eyes widened. "My lord," she whispered, voice shaking. "Her Majesty's body is still warm." The room stopped breathing. Essex stepped forward. He placed his hand over Elizabeth's chest, closed his eyes as if listening to the echo of a memory. Then he spoke, his voice no longer trembling, but low and hollow in a way that chilled everyone present. "She never left entirely. Elizabeth always stayed until the very last moment." Cecil wanted to dismiss it, wanted to claim the warmth was merely the lingering heat of a body gone still. But he couldn't, because when he touched her neck, he felt something reason refused to accept. Not warmth, a remnant of battle. As they dressed her, a lady lifted the neckline of the Queen's gown and gasped soundlessly. A faint bruise, pale violet, shaped like fingers or something that had once gripped her, lay beneath the skin. Not illness, not age, not human. Cecil yanked the gown up to cover it. "No one saw it," he snapped. "No one speaks of it. No one records it." Essex looked at Cecil. Not with rage, not with despair, but with something deeper, acceptance. But not the acceptance of a broken man, the acceptance of someone who understood that certain truths can only survive in darkness. "You will hide this night," Essex said. "You will erase it from every page, but it will not disappear." "It will not return," Cecil replied, unsure whether he was reassuring Essex or himself. Essex tilted his head slightly toward the direction of the room they had just left, the direction of the shadow. "You cannot be certain." A long silence fell, heavy as a tombstone. Then Essex stepped forward, bowed his head, and kissed Elizabeth's forehead. A final kiss, not of court, not of duty, but of a man saying goodbye to the only woman he had ever truly loved. He rose and turned to Cecil. "I will stay silent," he said, "not because I fear the truth, but because I fear what is worse than the truth, the thing you and I saw tonight." Cecil nodded, an unspoken pact forming between them. At dawn, London awoke to the official news. Queen Elizabeth I passed peacefully in her sleep, serene and at rest, having named her successor. No mention of the light. No mention of the darkness. No mention of the figure that stood behind Essex. The room where she died was sealed, then cleaned, then stripped of every trace. But the night guards swore that in the weeks that followed, even with the door locked and the curtains drawn, there were moments when a draft of freezing air slipped through the cracks, cold enough that the lantern outside flickered wildly as if trying to flee. Cecil never returned to that room. Essex left the palace days later, his eyes forever marked by the look of a man who had witnessed something no human was meant to see. And the history of England, written by human hands, recorded that Elizabeth died peacefully, her eyes gently closed, but those who were there that night never slept deeply again, because they knew Elizabeth did not die in peace. She died fighting the darkness that had followed her all her life. And sometimes, when the fog settles thick over Richmond, people swear they hear a whisper, soft as breath, not him. The last thing Elizabeth tried to say, the thing the court had to bury forever.